livelihoods, economic growth, and so on. And of course, the knowledge management function is aimed at trying to make our work more effective. So today I wanted to talk about change leadership. And I will leave it to the discussions to talk about what that looks like, particularly in a virtual environment. But I wanted to share some experiences and some insights that I've gained over leading change for 17 years now at USAID. So a lot of us, I think, do lead change, excuse me, in our organizations, and typically we're leading change from somewhere in the middle of our organizations, rather from the very top. There are a few people who do it there, but most of us are not at the very top layer, but we're trying to advance change efforts from wherever we are in our organizations. And in order to be effective at that, we need to be strategic and intentional about how we engage people at various levels throughout the organization in order to ensure that our approach is what's needed and to persuade those who make the resource decisions that it will work. And we need to bring our whole selves to the process. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that looks like. And I'll be sharing insights derived from my experiences leading knowledge management and organizational learning efforts at USAID. So that has included, when I joined USAID in 2003, I grew a knowledge management practice in one part of the agency focused on economic growth, and established and developed an area of work that supported a lot of different types of knowledge and organizational learning, and grew to reach several sectors in the agency's work. Then I moved to the agency's Policy Bureau in 2011, and until last November, led an effort called Collaborating, Learning, and Adapting. So this is USAID's approach to organizational learning in our program cycle. So the strategy, activity planning, implementation, and assessment effort. A lot of you may be familiar with Collaborating, Learning, and Adapting. We call it CLA, and I'll draw some examples from that work today. And then starting in November, I moved to this agency level function, which is a new function for USAID, spanning programs and operations in knowledge management. So in each of these instances, I was starting something that didn't exist before. And so it's a funny thing to be in startup mode in a large bureaucracy, because it's not the typical mode in which people work. But on the other hand, I think a lot of us find ourselves trying to advance something new within an established structure and culture. So I imagine that some of these insights will be familiar to you. So the first one that I wanted to share is that the change that you're leading needs to be the change that people want, or at least if you want to have any fun doing this. So how do you ensure that the change that you're leading is the change that people want? First and foremost, I have found that it's really important to take an appreciative approach and to find out what's happening and where people are feeling pain around obstacles that lie between them and what they're trying to achieve, and really understanding what that is like for them, and then co-creating with them the solution that you want to advance. I have seen people come in, take their own measure of a situation, diagnose it on their own, and then kind of launch some kind of policy directive, and it doesn't really work because people feel that they haven't been well understood. There's not an accurate assessment of what they're grappling with, and they also haven't been involved in the solution. So that co-creating the pilots and the refinements to the pilots has been really important. Time-consuming, but important. And then a third part of this is not focusing. Somebody might need to mute their microphone. I'm getting a little feedback. Not focusing in the first instance on the people who are most resistant to the change, but letting those laggards, just leave them on the side for the time being, and they will come along in good time. And I do want to say that I learned this the hard way. So when I started at USAID in the Office of Microenterprise Development in the Economic Growth Bureau, I was charged with creating this knowledge management practice. My colleagues didn't really have a clear sense of what that was. They sure didn't feel like it was their job. They felt that they used to introduce me as, here's Stacey, she manages our knowledge. And there were a couple of people in the office, two in particular, who were deeply resistant to what I was trying to advance. One was a classic knowledge hoarder, and his view was, well, I know it and that's good enough. I don't see why I have to share it. And in fact, that's probably not going to be good for me. And then another one was herself trying to establish a new area of practice, and she felt very protective of it and didn't want to share for that reason. So I spent a lot of effort on these two colleagues, and in retrospect, what I learned was that I didn't get any traction with them initially. I got lots of traction with my colleagues who were the early adopters, who were forward-leaning in wanting to establish this practice. They could see the value that it would add to the technical work that they were leading. They had a high tolerance for stuff that wasn't working right. They would help me figure out what was going wrong and help to make it better. So as we went, we started to get more people excited in the work and more people getting credit for using the knowledge and learning opportunities that we were creating to advance their technical work. And as that started to happen, the laggards, the grouchy colleagues, took note, and they started to feel left out, actually. So ultimately, they came around because they saw that everybody else was having a lot of fun and they didn't want to get left out. But none of that would have happened if we hadn't taken an appreciative approach, co-created with the early adopters, and left the laggards to come along later. Okay, so that's insight one. The change you're leading needs to be the change that people want. Insight two is your advocacy looks different depending on whether you're engaging the change implementers or the change funders. So what we've discovered, and this is especially true in the work that I had been involved in over the last decade, the USAID's collaborating, learning, and adapting work, we discovered and really learned again and again, I think, that what people who we were working with, staff who were developing programs and managing them and assessing them and adapting them, the kinds of evidence and knowledge that they wanted was really different from what the people who were making the funding decisions asked for. The implementers wanted to know, how will this help me? How does this not add to my workload? Am I allowed to do this? Can you show me how to do this? Can you connect me to others who are doing this? And also, will you share what I'm doing so I get recognized? That's what the implementers of the change process wanted to know. The funders had really different questions. Their questions were, why should we do this? Aren't we already doing this? What's the evidence that doing this will work? How much does it cost? And who among those who I trust can tell me whether I should do this? So the example I want to share here is around a learning agenda that we put in place called the evidence base for collaborating, learning, and adapting. And what we were getting at here was a gap in the knowledge management sector generally, which is, how do we measure the contribution that focusing on knowledge and learning actually makes a difference in terms of our operational efficiency and effectiveness, organizational effectiveness, and in terms of the development outcomes that we were trying to advance. This is a big question for anybody who's working in this area. How do we measure it? What's the evidence? How do we demonstrate that? How do we answer that question that the funders have about that? And so we developed a learning agenda, and I just want to shout out to Helen and her team with the Knowledge Management for Development Journal, because they are publishing the findings from our learning agenda around this in a two-part special series of that journal, which is super interesting, and you all should take a look at it. There's a lot of really good stuff there. the evidence base for CLA learning agenda was getting at what is the evidence that collaborating, learning, and adapting contributes to organizational effectiveness and development outcomes. And that it was designed to answer that question that funders had. At the same time, for implementers, they didn't want to know that. They assumed, they knew from experientially from their work, yes, if I learn more and I learn better, my work will be more effective. And what they wanted was case studies principally. And they also wanted to be connected in communities of practice with their colleagues who were doing the same kinds of things. So the insight then, your advocacy looks different depending on whether you're engaging change implementers or change funders. That kind of ties into the first insight, right? You need to understand what is the lay of the land. You need an appreciative assessment of what's happening. Okay, so then finally the third insight, people are people. It's important to meet them where they are and bring yourself along as well. And this really can't be overstated. And it's a little funny because it's something that we don't really talk about in the workplace very much, even though there's growing evidence that engaging people in what they care about is really important to their own satisfaction as staff, but also especially to the achieving the mission of the organization. So what does this mean? It means understanding what's important to people and connecting to them in a way that they find you credible and they see a bit of themselves in you, perhaps. And this is really important so that they understand and are bought into the change process from the start, and also so that they're open to you, they trust you, and they're open to what you're sharing and what you're trying to get them to do. So part of this involves understanding what people care about versus what they say they care about or what they're authorized to care about by the organizational culture. And that can be really tricky. And it gets at, are they saying what's really on their minds or not? I know that you all, as I have been in meetings where there's a lot of tension. And especially sort of if you're coming as an outsider, as we often are going to our field offices to provide support, coming as kind of an outsider, and you say something and all of a sudden you can kind of feel people sort of, stepping away from whatever that topic is, right? So that's a moment when you have connected with something that people care about, but they're not necessarily authorized to care about it or to talk about it in the workspace. In collaborating, learning, and adapting, we have found this tremendously important and valuable to explore. So what I want to do right now is I just want to share with you for a moment this slide. I'm going to see if I can do this right. And the answer might be no. Okay, I'm going to share my screen for a sec. Okay. This is a moment where we all feel the pain of my 10-year-old computer. Okay. Okay, can you see that? Can you guys see that? Okay, all right, great. So this is the collaborating, learning, and adapting framework. And I don't know if you can see the whole thing, but I'll describe it just really briefly. It's a holistic depiction of what organizational learning looks like in the USAID context, but it translates to a lot of different contexts as well. So it talks about, on the left-hand side, in our program cycle, that is in planning, managing, and assessing our programs in the field, what we need to do in order to collaborate well, in order to learn and then adapt based on the learning. On the right-hand side of the framework are the enabling conditions for collaborating, learning, and adapting. And these include culture, processes, and resources. And in culture, that blue slice, one of the really important pieces is openness. Openness to new information, openness to new ideas. So, okay, I'm gonna zip out of that right now. One of the really interesting things that we found in collaborating, learning, and adapting is that when we would go to missions and we had a maturity model based tool that we used with them so that they could conduct self-assessments and then do some action planning, they always wanted, almost always, gravitated to the enabling conditions side of that framework, and they wanted to start the conversation there often. Or they might start with one of the things on the other side, but thank you for the link, Helen. Or they might start the conversation on the other side, but then they would want to gravitate over to the enabling conditions side. And what we found was that people mostly really wanted to talk about openness to new ideas, openness to new information, openness to information that we don't necessarily want to hear. Excuse me. And it's because they cared about that. They saw it as essential to trying to make their programs more effective. And they also felt that the context didn't necessarily authorize them to care about it or to talk about it. And what we discovered was that by creating a process that engaged them around those questions, they didn't have to start the conversation. They didn't have to break through that piece of their culture that was resistant to talking about that stuff. It was a process that was there ready-made for them to enter into, and in that way it authorized them to talk about the stuff that they cared about, but that was difficult to care about. So that's a really important piece, I think, of leading change, is to figure out how you engage people around those obstacles that they don't even feel like they can acknowledge and talk about. There are a couple other things about this that I just want to mention quickly. One is, how can the change effort make them look good? That's important for everybody, implementers of the change and funders of the change. And also, yeah, okay, sorry. I think I'll leave it at that. So just to remember again, the 3 insights. The first one is the change that you're leading needs to be the change that people want. The second one is that your advocacy looks different depending on whether you're engaging people who are implementing the change and co-creating it with you, or whether you're engaging people who are making the funding decisions and the authorizing decisions. And then the third piece is meet people where they are and bring yourself along as well. Be your authentic self, make space for sharing your experience, especially around those things that tend to be unmentionable in our context, and they will relate to and be open to what you're trying to advance. So now I'm going to turn it back to John to set us up for our discussion, and our discussion is around how are you leading, or how can you lead change in your organization?